Hello, and welcome to a fresh episode of Global Tantrum, the show where several political scientists, today too, basically talk first ourselves and then you as well through the post-war international order. My name is Steve Pally. I'm the host. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, what's the latest? How are you?
Good man. I'm mourning our World Cup exit.
That was rough.
Rough is generous.
Yeah, an ugly bit of business. So look, so obviously we got destroyed by Belgium in the quarterfinals, 4-1. Honestly, we're lucky to get out of there losing by that much. I figured they'd score 5 or 6 the way things were going.
Yeah. I
Ignominious
mean,
defeat.
granted, we also gave up that one, but
Oh, right.
yeah, it could have been a lot worse. What were your thoughts on the red card controversy?
Oh, yeah. I think Balogun being there or not wouldn't have mattered,
Oh,
given
well,
just the
we
talent disparity.
we clearly saw that that was the case, but
Yes.
yeah, it was weird. It was like I was obviously happy he was playing, and the play that earned the red card, I should say, I don't know anything about soccer, but the people I know who do said, yeah, it looks bad, but it's kind of incidental contact. Their feet got tangled, which is what it looked like to me. So
Yeah.
probably should not have earned a red card. But then I had mixed feelings about the president of the United States intervening in FIFA.
Yeah.
And
Deeply mixed feelings. The sort of atavistic, nationalistic part of me was like, hell yeah. Like, we need him out there. And then the more rational part of me was like, this sets a terrible precedent, which is mostly what this administration seems to exist to do. And it's not going to work. It's going to probably result in the exact opposite of what we wanted. And indeed, Belgium seemed extra motivated.
yeah, I mean, I don't think it probably made a difference in the outcome, but
Nah.
since we're talking about politicization today, I was uh I was not
Haha.
necessarily happy to see the World Cup politicized.
We are. Yeah, and like more generally, like setting aside that particular game, it's like we were supposed to do better this year. We're supposed to have a better team this year. We're hosting this year, so on and so forth. And we went out in the quarterfinals, or excuse me, before the quarterfinals, in the round of
Yeah.
16, the way Team USA always does, like
Yeah, but
clockwork.
I feel like that's the tenor of the mood. I mean, it's different this year, obviously, because the US was hosting, which was cool. And,
It
you know,
was cool and it remains cool because
yeah,
like the games are all on US time so we can watch them. And like
totally.
living in LA, it's been very cool to watch people lose their minds over this stuff, including my son, by the way.
Oh, right on. And
Yeah.
maybe this will be the time that this spurs like a major generation of soccer players. But I feel like I hear that every 4 years and I believe it every 4 years. And this time I'm going to remain a little skeptical.
Look, people respond to incentives. The best athletes in this country want to get paid. The way to do that is, generally speaking, not in soccer, unless you were good enough to go to Europe. But like, even then, right? The
Which
best
some of
athletes
our
in this,
guys are now, right?
they are. But like, are they playing for like Man City? Are they winning Euro championships? Are they winning Premier League titles? No, they're not. They don't. They're not good enough to be on those teams. Even our best so-called best player, Pulisic, right? He's on AC Milan, which is at this point kind of like a second tier European team. Our other best guy, Folarin Balogun, he of the controversial rescinded red card, and he was probably our best player in this tournament. I think he plays for Monaco, which is also a second or third tier team, right? So it's like, yeah, but like we just don't have that kind of high end talent.
All right.
So
Well, 2030.
2030 is another year, 4 years from now. Yeah, and that's the other thing that's just so hard about it. It's like every 4 years.
Yeah.
So we have time to forget and get desensitized and then resensitized all over again. You actually had the transition a few minutes ago. We're talking about politicization in the United States. for a very important institution in the United States, that being the U.S. military. Why are we talking about this? Well, the second Trump administration has a Secretary of Defense. He calls himself the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. And we've talked about Hegseth a number of times already on this show in reference to, for instance, the national security strategy, in reference to the Iran war, other
Which
things.
we should say might be restarting.
Yes, seems to be lower intensity, but yeah, potentially restart. We'll see. I'm sure the Israelis would be thrilled. But anyway, Pete Hegseth is a former, actually decorated combat soldier, not like Congressional Medal of Honor, but he served in, I believe, Iraq and Afghanistan. I think he led an infantry platoon. I think he has 2 Bronze Stars and a combat infantryman badge, and he exited as major. So, pretty good military career. Ended up on Fox News because he is well known as a conservative ideologue. Trump liked him on Fox News and decided to put him in his administration as Secretary of Defense. Usually, Secretary of Defenses have thicker resumes than Hegseth does, but he got the nod. And part of what he has been doing is reshaping the military very deliberately along ideological lines. What do I mean by that? Well, he's fired or forced to retire over a dozen highly placed military officers, right, Galen?
Yeah, they tend to have a few things in common. So
Interesting.
The direct impetus for us doing this particular episode was a guy named C.Q. Brown.
Yep.
Who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, appointed by Biden, only the second African American to hold that position, the first, of course, being Colin Powell in the 90s. It's worth noting, by the way, he was an Air Force general. Trump actually nominated him to be the Air Force Chief of Staff in 2020. I believe he was confirmed by the Senate in that vote 98-0. When Biden put him forward for JCS chair, there were something like 10 or 11 Republican dissenting votes, which might not sound like a lot in today's day and age, but that's actually pretty unusual to see that larger number of votes against. And the objections that those senators gave were things like this was, being done for things like affirmative action or an equal opportunity hire, as they put it, which if you look at the man's resume, seems like a very difficult case to make. Lifelong service in the Air Force. But this has been one piece of he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs with a guy named Peter Feaver, who teaches at Duke, expert in civil military relations, who we're going to talk about a bit, expressing concern about the military being politicized. This was one of the issues that gets raised, is the issue of promotions, sort of forced retirements, people being forced to leave the military, and they tend to be women and minority members of the military.
Yeah, let's go through the list real fast. We can go through the list, and I have it in front of me. Key firings and forced retirements out of Pete Hegseth. So the Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George, the Army Chief of Chaplains, Major General William Green, the Commander of Army Transformation and Training Command, General David Hodney, Commander of U.S. Army Europe and Africa, General Chris Donahue. That's the most recent one. He was
that was one that actually got, I don't know if pushback's the right word, but some members of Congress actually voiced some concern about that because I think he was seen as admired by both parties.
Yeah, totally. That was in June, so very recent. Admiral Lisa Franchetti, Chief of Naval Operations. That's the Navy's top uniformed officer. We talked about C.Q. Brown, Air Force General Timothy Ha, the head of the U.S. National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command. Another admiral who is a lady, and the list goes on. And yeah, these people have a lot in common demographically. as you've mentioned. Now, Hegseth himself has described his hiring and firing as being strictly merit based and colorblind. And we're not here to pass judgment on that. Neither are we here to pass judgment on whether or not the civilian leader of the U.S. military has the right to do what he's doing. He does. And that's actually a really important point when we talk about civil military relations in the United States. And we'll talk about the history behind the sort of strict divide between those 2 points and why civilians have always been in charge of the military instead of the other way around. There's some history behind it that I think is pretty interesting. But setting all of that aside, do you necessarily want your top military leadership turning over every change of administration? Does that make sense? Is that a good idea?
No.
The answer is no.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think it's a short essay. I don't think they brought that up necessarily in the CQ Brown fever piece, but that is a concern, right? And Risa Brooks, who I think's at Marquette, wrote a paper in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago where she expresses concern about this, and it's worth noting that in that paper by CQ Brown, he does say like both parties have been guilty of this to some degree recently. He says the Biden administration used the military for things like operations related to COVID. But yeah, it's a point Brooks makes, which is if every time there's a shift in party in the White House, that's going to have implications for national security. There's really no way around that. And I think it's important to point out, like, this isn't necessarily an old problem, but it's not super new either. Mark Esper, who is Secretary of Defense during Trump's first term, who I think Trump fired at the very end of his term in office, was concerned about the deployment of the U.S. military to U.S. cities, which is another point that CQ Brown raised in that paper. Is the military generally should not be used for domestic law enforcement.
And we'll get into that. Yeah, posse comitatus, right?
Yeah. And he refers to one George Washington saying, if democracies come to rely on the military to fix issues like this, you are not going to have a democracy. An example I'm pretty familiar with is Turkey, or now Turkiye, as it were, which the Turkish military, highly professional military, saw itself as sort of the guardian of the Turkish Republic. And without going into the details, and anytime things sort of were going off the rails politically, the Turkish military would step in. They did this in 1960, 1971, 1980, sort of informally in the late 90s. Turkey today is not a great example of a flourishing liberal democracy.
Not exactly.
So, that's the sort of thing Washington was concerned about. And by the way, this is why generally when U.S. politicians are speaking to the military or giving an address, there's a norm to stay nonpartisan.
Yes.
And that norm, at a minimum, has been bent. It was actually just fairly recently, Vice President J.D. Vance was addressing some troops. And, I think he said something like, I've got the devil on my shoulder and the angel on the other, and the angel's telling me to stay nonpartisan. But then, he made a joke at Joe Biden's expense right after that. That might not sound like a big deal or just sort of like a flippant quip, but like, you're not supposed to do that because the military is not supposed to be an arena of politicization.
Yes. And yeah, you refer to that norm as being bent. I think it was actually broken in, I believe, September of last year when Hegseth abruptly called hundreds of senior military leaders from all over the world.
From all over the world.
Like literally all over the world, including like active combat zones in the middle of operations, to come out to Quantico, which is, I believe, Marine Corps headquarters in Virginia, and attend what ended up being like almost a campaign rally where, he and Trump came out and started talking about the enemy within and throwing a bunch of like partisan red meat out and making it clear that he would not tolerate a woke military.
Yeah, and that's
Is it?
another priority, right? Ideologically, is getting
Yeah.
wokeness out of the military. So these are the sorts of things people that study civil military relations are pretty concerned about in the United States right now, like deploying the military for domestic law enforcement, getting heavily involved in a way that seems ideological in the promotion and firing processes that, generally are the military is more autonomous, and some of these norms being bent. And, one thing they say in that article is, and, you made this point when we were talking offline, like the US military is perhaps the last remaining institution in the United States that garners high approval ratings from both parties.
Yeah. It's not
It,
higher education. It's not big business. It's not any branch of government.
higher education's, yeah, that's a good one. You have
Yeah.
to back that long when that actually was a high approval rating. And
It's
so
not law enforcement. Yeah.
so like that's the concern is this is, one of the last standing institutions in the US where you get.
Respect.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. And everybody does still respect individual service members pretty much, even if they don't know any service members personally or have any in their family, which is increasingly the case. Another thing
Yeah.
we were talking about was the fact that at this point, with I think what, roughly 50 years of being an all volunteer military at this point,
Yeah.
after the Vietnam War, less than 1% of this country's admittedly large population has served. 80% of active duty service members come from a military family at this point. So you can look at that and be like, well, that's the system working as it's intended. But you could also look at that being like, well, this is now a hereditary warrior caste, and civilians simply have zero experience. By and large, voters have zero experience with what it means to serve. And
Yeah. Yeah. And like, people I've spoken to that study this stuff, the research is kind of mixed. Like, it's not totally clear that what was it, the skin in the game thesis that like, if you or someone or a family member serves in the military, you'll be like more cautious about deploying military force. It's not clear that that finding totally holds up. But I do
yeah,
think things like, a sense of unity, right? Like this is the idea some people promote. Maybe it doesn't have to be military service, but like,
national service.
yeah, everyone should serve like for 1 year in some capacity. There's a lot of reasons why that hasn't happened. And I'm sure we can list some good reasons why that hasn't happened as well. But it does raise this question of out of sight, out of mind, which I think is potentially an issue.
It's definitely an issue. The question is like, under what circumstances is it an issue? It could be perhaps a ambitious military leader
Right.
uh, stepping up into politics, which is something that Harry Truman was worried about at one point in time.
Yeah.
And this particular incident, which you were talking about a little bit earlier before we started recording, was, I think, the genesis of modern civil military theory, which was developed by very famous political scientist Samuel Huntington. Right,
Yeah.
Galen? So you want to like recount that anecdote?
Sure. So Huntington wrote this book, The Soldier and the State, I think 1957. I had to kind of dust off some grad school notes, but it's like,
Yeah.
it's one of the first major treatments of civil military relations in the American context. And as you were saying, the Douglas MacArthur, who was the, supreme commander of American forces during the Korean War, that was the case that motivated him to write the book. So MacArthur, very critical of Truman's strategy of limited war in Korea, wanted to escalate more, thought you needed to be bolder and more aggressive. Truman fired him. And MacArthur was actually quite popular in many parts of the United States, sort of felt out the possibility of a presidential run. Somewhat coincidentally, by the way, the guy that does run on the Republican ticket in 1952 is a guy named Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah, you may have heard
Um,
of him.
himself an important military man you might have heard of. But he was worried about this problem you just laid out of the man on horseback. And so he lays out this argument that basically says, look, the military, I think he refers to it as objective control. What did he mean by that? The military should be characterized by three things: expertise, that is, they should be experts in what he calls the management of violence; corporateness, right? They should have kind of a self identity, just like any other profession does. You have specialized jargon, you have an identity as a, professional member of the military; and responsibility, which is you are subordinate to the civilian leadership. And that's how you kind of solve that problem. Yeah. So, I mean, for Huntington, the military is in a completely separate sphere from politics and civilian life. They're two separate camps. And there's been a number of challenges to this claim that in practice, that's not only really not possible, but not even necessarily desirable. So kind of the polar opposite of this is I think it's Morris Janowitz thesis, which is about, what does he call it? Convergence, the idea of the citizen soldier, that the way to deal with this is that the military needs to internalize apolitical norms and nonpartisan norms, because walling the military off from politics really isn't feasible. And, people like Risa Brooks, who I mentioned earlier, make the point, look, like, it is actually not possible in practice, particularly for something like unconventional or low-level conflicts, to separate out military, political, civilian, tactical, strategic issues. You just can't do that stuff. So another good example was the famous clash between President Obama and General Stanley McChrystal back in 2010, when essentially the Obama administration was doing this major review of whether to escalate the war in Afghanistan. It goes on pretty much his entire first year in office. And McChrystal and his advisors are kind of getting impatient. They do want more resources for the war. And you start seeing articles in the press criticizing the White House and the process, putting out their own plan for how many troops they want. Eventually what happens, I think it was Rolling Stone of all outlets that got McChrystal on the record being highly critical of the administration, and Obama fires him. And it's like, that's a good example of military insubordination. But more importantly, it's an example of like, that is a case where it is not a total war. The strategic cannot be separated from the tactical, from the political. And so not only is it not feasible, but ideally you would have liked the two men kind of working in concert on, okay, what are our interests? What does that mean in terms of what military strategy should look like, so on and so forth. And then finally, I'll just very briefly, the other one is the argument Peter Feaver lays out in Armed Servants, which is a principal agent model, which, if I think back to grad school, right, the canonical example is you go to the mechanic, you got a problem with your car, you're the principal, the agent is the mechanic, they have the expertise, you're kind of highly reliant on them. How do you know, right? Like, you walk in, they're like, yeah, we had to replace whatever, I don't know anything about cars, the rotator splint. It's going to run you $4 million. It's like, well, sorry, man.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like, you need to have an honest person in place to do that kind of business. Well, same thing applies. In this case, the civilian leadership is the principal. The military is the agent. The agent still has their own incentives and their own interests, right? Like, militaries often want to focus on offense. They want large budgets. They don't want amorphous missions, right? And Fever's argument is like, it is better to have the military carrying out bad orders or like dumb ideas than to shirk their responsibility and try to sabotage what the civilian leadership wants.
That's very interesting.
And so you can't really separate these spheres out.
Yeah. So I'll say two things about that. First is, I think the Vietnam War is in many ways a case study in what happens when the military actually inverts that and goes along with well, actually follows Fever's recommendation and goes along with civilian control, even though it knows that it's a bad idea.
Yeah, a good
So,
example, by the way. Vietnam often seen as a case of civilian micromanaging, from
yes.
Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Good point.
Yeah. So civilians were very much in control of that war. Yeah, like McNamara and his whiz kids, right? So these leaders, these quants, basically from civilian life, and General Motors and Ford Motor Company, and so on. And they looked at war as a numbers game. The people on the ground doing the fighting knew that was really not the case, and just killing as many people as possible wasn't going to accomplish that much. But it continued to happen, resulting in all kinds of military and political problems, to put it mildly. So that was a clear case of like absolute civilian control, but civilians who refuse to listen to evidence and expertise from the military. You don't want that either.
Although I would also say in that case, right, like you have, Westmoreland talking about the body count and being like, what was it, the crossover point, like, which when I took these classes in college, it was like once we killed enough people and secured enough territory, like then things will get easier. Can I give one other example and then like
Yeah.
draw a distinction? So another one that just came to mind is Lincoln and McClellan during the
Yes.
Civil War.
Yeah. George
Um,
McClellan.
which like really until you get Ulysses S. Grant, who's, commanding Union armies earlier in the war, he's at Shiloh. He's involved in a lot of the early battles, but he doesn't take command of the Army of the Potomac, which is kind of the main Union army, I think, until 1864.
Pretty late in the
And
game.
prior to that, like if you study the Civil War, like the Union does not have great leadership militarily. And one of Lincoln's great frustrations is his perception that George McClellan, who initially was the commander of the Army of the Potomac, and a highly decorated military man, we're saying, who I believe then runs against him in 1864.
That's right.
Yeah. So is that he's not fighting, right? And not taking advantage of the Union's superiority in manpower and resources. And actually, if you look at when Grant first takes over, like a lot of those battles are really bloody and
Yeah.
kind of lopsided in casualty terms against the Union. But guess what? That strategy works when you've got overwhelming advantages in manpower and resources.
France's major innovation was attritional warfare.
Yeah, it's
That's
like
exactly
Cold
right.
Harbor, right? It's just like this horrible,
Bloodbath.
Yeah, exactly. But that's an example of, at least in President Lincoln's perception, the military not wanting to fight or not carry out his preferred military strategy. The example you just gave was troops being insubordinate, essentially because of low morale and lack of pay. The MacArthur one is an example of the military wanting to fight more vigorously,
right,
and posing a political threat, and ditto for the McChrystal Obama example. What we're seeing today seems to me pretty distinct from all of those episodes.
It's not about tactics, right? It's about composition.
Yeah.
And not only that, it's about the wisdom or ability to use the military for political ends.
Right. So
Arthur didn't run for president, and McClellan, none of these guys, Eisenhower, didn't run for president as military officers, right? Notably.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, just to give you another example, I don't know, maybe if he's still Senator Tommy Tuberville from Alabama.
I believe he is, yeah.
So he, 2 years ago, was holding up hundreds of officer promotions. I think it was like 400, close to 450, 440, something like that, to protest the Biden administration's policy of allowing service members to take paid leave if they needed to travel to states for abortion services because the state they lived in did not have that legally. Leaving that issue aside, since that's not what this podcast is about, like that is interfering in an ideological way in military affairs. I'm not familiar enough with the topic to say in unprecedented manner, but in a way that certainly was regarded as highly unusual. And what we're describing today with Hegseth's Defense Department and the second Trump administration's approach to military composition, promotion, by the way, like deploying US troops to cities, also highly unusual. We can talk about that and, the carve out in the Insurrection Act. But these are not issues similar to past episodes that typically get studied when it comes to American civil military relations. And
Yeah,
I think for some people, this is more concerning.
it is. So to be clear, like when military members are polled about their sort of political orientation, it's pretty clear that the institution has a conservative political bent.
But
It's
but but not overwhelming.
not
You're
overwhelming, number
you're
one.
right, it leans.
And
Yeah.
number two, the vast majority of military personnel are well disciplined and they're really serious about remaining nonpartisan on the job. Like during this conclave at Quantico last fall, where Hegseth flew out, hundreds of people, decorated military officers, and then like did a bunch of like campaign stuff for the Republican Party with Trump. The military officers reportedly listened with polite attention, did not cheer, did not clap, did not react in any way, even if they wanted to, right?
Yeah.
And for that matter, they didn't boo, even if they wanted to. Either reaction would have been inappropriate. So they had to sit there. They had to be disciplined. And that's exactly what they did.
And this recent episode I spoke about with Vance, where he makes the joke at Biden's expense, I actually went and watched the video. I think there's like one person in the background who kind of smiles, but yeah, for the most part, it's like crickets.
Yeah. And that's kind of what we want to see. That means that the military is well disciplined. It's taking its normative responsibilities seriously. And like on an individual level, like people don't want to have their careers ended when the opposite party takes over and purges the military, right? Like, suppose a Democrat, suppose a bunch of people cheered, right, at this thing in late 2025 at Quantico. President Gavin Newsom or whoever comes in and he watches that video and just fires everybody who cheered. It's like that's not good, right? But to even like as a civilian to even put that on the military and to offer that level of temptation is like it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Frankly.
And it does, like what you're listening to right now, it does in the kind of different theories of Civ Mill make me lean more towards the Janowitz case, which is like, of course, every person has views. Like every person has all sorts of ideological, political, like whatever views you want to bring up. So like really it is about instilling this norm of nonpartisanship. And I do take some comfort in knowing that seems to be holding up. One question I have for you, you alluded to the founding fathers, it's right there in the Bill of Rights. One case I'm familiar with is the part of the debate during the First World War over whether to raise a large army, even just in preparation for intervening. Ironically, he then goes about and does just this, but you can see Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, expressing concern about having a large military establishment and how contrary to democratic principles that would be.
Right.
The U.S. military for many years, really up until the Cold War or World War II, was like a constabulary, more or less. But I mean, is it simply that? I mean, why do you think the United States has not really suffered or dealt with this problem in a way that many countries in the world have? Obviously authoritarian and autocratic governments, but this is something democracies struggle with as well. And those cases we brought up notwithstanding, in general, I think U.S. military and civil military relations has a fairly admirable record of staying subordinate to the civilian leadership, being nonpartisan. What's the explanation for that?
Yeah, I think we've done pretty well so far by these standards. Like France has had some issues, for instance, over a long period of time. Another like long-standing democracy that hasn't been as stable as our democracy because it's had this type of issue, right? I'm thinking of like, the war in Algeria and everything that came out of that, right? It's major instability. And then younger democracies as well, the South American democracies, Brazil, Argentina, especially, but there are other examples. And we call them younger democracies, but in fact, these countries received their independence like not too much later than the US. Different colonial legacies, of course, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's like in comparative terms, right? Another example would be, Japan, where the army basically took over prior to, in the interwar period. And
Yep.
we got Japanese imperial militarism, a really fun time over there. You could argue that that was not a fully consolidated democracy, but in fact, like it was basically a constitutional monarchy with a parliament and everything. But, they fought a bunch of wars, including a war that they couldn't win on mainland China. And the military officers just got more and more politically extreme. And they felt that they were not being given the resources they needed to win by the civilian leadership.
Yeah.
So going back to the US, like, yes, for much of this country's history, we have not had a standing. We've had militias. We've had armies that are called up at the start of a conflict and dismissed at the end of it. That carries us pretty much all the way to the early Cold War.
Yeah.
So that's just, a bunch of the history right there. We have plenty of ex-military politicians, especially after the Civil War. There's basically an entire generation of U.S. leadership that served in the Civil War as officers, up to, I think, William McKinley, right? Was the last president.
Grant, Garfield, I can't remember, Harrison, Cleveland. Yeah.
Yeah. And senators and everything else, right? So that's part of the explanation. The other part of the explanation is we've had an all-volunteer professional military since then that has been professional. And
Yeah.
civilians have respected that level of professionalism. The norm has come from the civilians.
Yeah. I guess the question I have is why, right? I think your point on the draft is important, although the statistics you laid out, I do find alarming in terms of like the percentage of people and the percentage that come from military families. As you were just listening to talk, these are completely unproven, but just kind of thoughts I had while I was listening to you. War is really corrosive to
Yes.
democratic liberties. What's the saying? Like when war starts, the laws go silent or something like that.
The laws and the ability, like deliberations, right? That's simply not how military command works. It can't work that way.
Well,
you
so
know?
I mean, you can look at other countries, but you have to. You can look right here, right? Go read
Yes.
about what happens in the United States during World War One. Like horrible time for legacy of American civil liberties. This is when you get the Espionage Act, which is still on the books.
Red Scare.
Imprisoning members of Congress in that case. World War II, obviously the internment of Japanese Americans in camps in the United States. So Civil War, suspension of habeas corpus. I'm only saying all of this because the United States fights a lot more wars than it used to. And, since September 11th, you think of the growth of the American surveillance state and, things like Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, although I think that actually just expired. It's not, it seems possible to me that it's like, well, the more you're at war, the more democratic norms suffer. And I don't think the US is alone in that being the case. Another one is like we're hyperpolarized, and I'm not going to try to explain why that's the case. And we've been hyperpolarized before. but we have more risk factors associated with democratic decline and hyperpolarization. And also, like, polarization has not ended well in the past either, right? Like, we had a civil war in this country,
Yeah.
which is not military. Well, you could argue it's partially military insubordination.
Yeah. Robert E.
Uh,
Lee, right?
so, like, there's that.
Yeah. He
Um,
resigned his commission, but yes.
yeah, you know, you said it's kind of since the start of the Cold War, right? Eisenhower, like, we have two farewell addresses in the United States that we care about. We don't care about any other president's farewell address.
That's true.
One, one of them is Washington's, right?
Mhm.
Um, Entangling alliances. The other is Dwight Eisenhower's warning about the rise of a military industrial complex.
Yeah. So I know we're running out of time. So I here is my specific worry about this problem in the context of the modern United States. We've laid out a bunch of facts. We have a very small number of people, small percentage of the country serving in the military, meaning that it's cut off from most people. The vast majority of people have just no experience. And vice versa. They're isolated, right? They feel apart. Number one. Number two, we have this hyperpolarized political environment where people are getting more and more frustrated with the government's inability to solve any of the major problems that this country has. Number three, we have the degradation, at least in the direction from civilian to military, of the norm that the military should be nonpartisan and should not involve itself in politics. Suppose that that degradation becomes bidirectional. So that the military then is like, oh, actually, we want to get involved in politics. And then the citizenry invites it in, right? So it's less a military coup. And well, I suppose it would be a military coup, but it would be more like democratic suicide.
But this is why I found it important that Brown wrote in that article, like, once you're relying on the military for this sort of thing, like, you've already lost the game, right? Like,
Yeah,
this is always what happened in the Turkish case I laid out, right? Like,
yeah.
people weren't necessarily upset that the military were intervening in politics. In
No,
some cases,
we want them to because
it's
nothing works right. The military has been unwilling to do that historically, but if the norms are degraded, then the firewall comes down.
yeah. So
And
I do want to say, like, because that is an important point. Like, we've laid out a lot of concerning things here. I'm not ready to call this a 5 alarm fire or whatever. Like,
yeah,
there are still barriers in place. I think you are correct. I think the military remains a highly professionalized institution. I
yep,
think there is a reason that it is the one of the few remaining, if maybe the last American institution that is universally admired.
yeah,
Um, and I think that counts for a lot. And so I'm not trying to say by any means that, like, we're witnessing the death of the principle of military professionalism or military subordination to civilian control or any of that. I do think that this is something that the United States is extremely lucky to have. And so anything poses a threat or raises risk of or eroding that principle is worth talking about. And some of the things that have been happening recently strike me as concerning.
it's of a piece with like our other episodes on the debt.
Oh,
And
interesting.
yeah, it's we've had these huge advantages, right, for such a long time, and we see them slowly degrading or getting frittered away or wasted, right? And like we have such a reservoir of advantage that like nothing's an immediate emergency or anything, but it's like, okay, like how long does it need to degrade before we are in an emergency state? And then is it too late? I don't know. I don't know that anybody knows, right? All we can do is like see the warning signs and talk about it as political scientists.
Yeah. And I guess I should say, I don't know if you have, just to put a bow on it, I haven't seen any reporting about, as happens in like authoritarian countries, right? Like Saddam's Iraq being maybe the best example, where like the information the military starts providing to the civilian leadership is incorrect because no one wants to upset the boss. I haven't seen any reporting on anything like that with whether it's the Iran war or anything else. Like it seems like the military still does its job very well.
About the Iran war was the military and intelligence services warned Trump, like, hey, this, you know, well, yeah, certainly the intelligence service were like, hey, like, we don't think this is going to accomplish what you want it
Oh,
to.
and right before the war, I might get the specifics wrong, but the current JCS chairman, Kane,
Dan Kane,
Dan
Raising
Kane,
Kane. Yeah.
Raising Kane, General Raising Kane. I don't think it's been confirmed, but there was some speculation right before the war. Remember, there was like that
Yeah.
doubt expressed by the military about it. Some people thought he might have been behind, which, by the way, is another example potentially of the military and the political not being separable. And
Yeah.
whether it was him or someone else, like, yeah.
Kane is Hegseth's handpicked guy that he fired CQ Brown to put in. And presumably he thought that, you know, Kane would be gung ho. And like with the ideological program and the Iran hawkery, right? But in fact, Kane has been, from what we can tell, professional, which is what we have come to expect, right?
Yeah. And we are lucky that we get to have that expectation is all I'm saying. And
it's a luxury.
We should keep it that way if we can.
The United States is swimming in luxuries that it doesn't, like the average American is not aware of and doesn't consider luxury.
Well, I mean, you can sort of see why it's taken for granted. Like,
yeah.
But, you know, I guess I would just say there are plenty of places in the world where this is not the state of affairs normally.
Try Turkey, try Pakistan is another example.
Pakistan, Egypt. Yeah, man, there's no shortage.
The list goes on, right? Yeah. So, all right, shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
All right. This has been Global Tantrum. See you guys next time. Thanks, Galen.
Thanks, man.